Territory of New Mexico, 1870. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding Kathleen Benson's cabin, carrying with it the bite of early winter. She stood on the porch, her knuckles white around the handle of her father's old shotgun, watching as Chi split logs with precise, powerful strokes. His copper skin gleamed with sweat despite the cold, and Kathleen forced herself to look away. "Storm's coming," she said, more to fill the silence than to inform him of something he already knew. Chi had an uncanny sense about the weather, far better than her own. He paused, the axe balanced mid-swing, and looked toward the darkening sky. 3 days. Heavy snow. His English was perfect, though he used it sparingly. Each word seemed measured, as if he allocated language with the same careful precision he devoted to every task. Kathleen nodded, grateful for the practical exchange. These were the conversations she could manage: weather, chores, supplies. Safe topics that didn't lead to dangerous thoughts. "We should bring in more firewood," she said, already moving toward the stack he'd created. "I'll do it." Chi set down the axe and moved to stop her, his fingers briefly brushing her sleeve. Kathleen froze at the contact, however innocent. 5 months since her parents' death, 4 months of being alone in this cabin with only Chi for company. 4 months of pretending she didn't notice the way his dark eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. "I'm not helpless," she said, harsher than intended. "My father taught me to survive in these mountains." "I know." There was no offense in his voice, just that same steady calm. "You're stronger than most men I've met." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. She'd grown accustomed to the disapproving glances from the people in town whenever she rode in for supplies. A woman alone, living in the wilderness with an Apache man. The whispers followed her like shadows. "She'll end up with her throat cut. That savage is just waiting for his chance. The Benson girl's gone wild. If only they knew how wrong they were." Chi had been nothing but respectful since her father had hired him last year. Even now, with no one to witness his behavior but the mountains themselves, he kept a careful distance. "We should check the smokehouse too," Kathleen said, changing the subject. "Make sure everything's secure before the storm." Chi nodded, already gathering an armload of split logs. Kathleen watched him work, the fluid economy of his movements, the quiet strength in his hands. Her father had always said Chi was worth 3 ordinary men on the property. Thomas Benson had been different from other settlers. He'd fought alongside Apaches in the Mexican-American War and held none of the typical prejudices. "Judge a man by his actions, not by the stories others tell about his kind," her father had told her. It was one of the many lessons she clung to now that he was gone. The autumn fever had taken both her parents within a week of each other. One moment Kathleen had been the sheltered daughter of a respected family. The next, she was alone in the world with nothing but a remote cabin and 40 acres of mountain wilderness. At 23, she was already considered past her prime for marriage, and the few offers that came after her parents' death were transparent attempts to claim her property. So she'd sent the suitors away and shocked everyone by announcing her intention to run the homestead herself. Only Chi had shown no surprise at her decision. The memory of her last trip into town still burned in her mind. It had been 6 weeks ago, before the first frost. She'd ridden in for supplies, a list carefully prepared and money counted out. Precious little of it remained after paying for her parents' funeral. The storekeeper, Mr. Daniels, had greeted her with forced politeness, his eyes darting to the doorway behind her, as if expecting someone else. "All alone today, Miss Benson?" he'd asked, his tone suggesting concern but his eyes alight with curiosity. "Yes," she'd replied simply, handing over her list. She'd learned it was best to say as little as possible, to give the gossips as little fuel as she could. As Daniels gathered her supplies, Mrs. Peterson and her daughter had entered the store, their conversation faltering when they spotted Kathleen. "Why, Miss Benson?" Mrs. Peterson had exclaimed with exaggerated surprise. "How brave of you to come to town by yourself." Kathleen had merely nodded, knowing what would come next. "I heard Jacob Mercer offered to buy your property," Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Quite generous of him considering the circumstances." "Mr. Mercer's offer wasn't to my liking," Kathleen had replied, keeping her tone even. Mrs. Peterson had clucked her tongue in disapproval. A woman alone can't manage 40 acres, especially in these mountains. And with winter coming, she'd shaken her head dolefully. "Not to mention keeping that Indian on, it isn't proper." Chi works for me, Kathleen had said, her patience wearing thin, just as he worked for my father. But your father was present, Mrs. Peterson had insisted, her implication clear. You must think of your reputation, dear. People talk. Let them, Kathleen had responded, taking her parcels from Daniel's and placing them in her satchel. Good day, Mrs. Peterson. She'd felt their eyes on her back as she'd left the store, heard the whispers resume the moment the door closed behind her. It was the same everywhere in town. The doctor's office, the post office, even the church, where Reverend Townsend had taken her aside after the service to express his concerns for her soul. Only at the blacksmith's had she found respite. Old Jim Cooper had known her father for 20 years and held him in high regard. Pay no mind to the gossips, he'd told her as he'd inspected the shoe on her mare. Your pa knew what he was about when he hired that Apache. Seen him around town a few times. Keeps to himself, but he's got honest eyes. Trust your own judgment, girl, just like your pa taught you. That brief moment of understanding had sustained her on the long ride back to the cabin, where Chi had been waiting, ready to help unload her supplies without being asked. Now as she followed him to the smokehouse, Kathleen found herself grateful once again for his steady presence. Inside the small wooden structure, the air was fragrant with the smoky aroma of curing meat. Venison hung from the rafters, the result of Chi's hunting skills, alongside the remains of a wild turkey. It wasn't much, but it would help see them through the coming storm. We'll need more, Chi said, surveying their supplies. I'll hunt tomorrow before the weather turns. I'll come with you, Kathleen decided. It wasn't just about the hunt. She needed to be away from the cabin to feel the freedom of the forest one last time before they were trapped by snow. Chi studied her face for a moment, then nodded. We leave at dawn. As the day dimmed toward evening, Kathleen retreated inside to prepare their meal. The cabin was small but sturdy, 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above. Her father had built it with his own hands when he'd claimed this land 15 years ago. Every log and nail spoke of his determination and his love for this wild, beautiful place. She stirred the beans simmering over the fire and added the last of the fresh herbs from her garden. Soon there would be nothing but what they had preserved or could hunt. The isolation would be complete once the heavy snows came. When Chi entered, he brought with him the scent of pine and cold air. Without being asked, he filled the wash basin and cleaned his hands. These small courtesies were typical of him, a man who observed and adapted, who seemed to intuit what was needed before it was spoken. Marshall rode by while you were inside, he said, drying his hands on a scrap of toweling. Kathleen tensed. What did he want? To warn you. Chi's face remained impassive. Said there's been trouble with some of the other tribes, raids on homesteads to the north, and he thought you might be planning to join them. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. A slight tightening around Chi's eyes was the only indication her words had hit their mark. He suggested you might be safer in town for the winter. This is my home. Kathleen set 2 plates on the table with unnecessary force. I'm not leaving because of his fears or anyone else's. Chi sat down across from her. In the flickering lamplight, the planes of his face seemed more defined, the shadows deeper. The Apache are not my tribe anymore, but they are still my people. If my presence here puts you in danger— Stop, Kathleen cut him off. You work for me now. My father trusted you, I trust you. She served the food, avoiding his gaze. Besides, you're the only reason I've managed to keep this place running. It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging her dependence on him, and it left her feeling vulnerable. Silence stretched between them as they ate, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They'd developed a rhythm over these months, a wordless understanding that sometimes felt more intimate than conversation. My father spoke of you often, she said suddenly, surprising herself. Before you came to work for us. He said you saved his life during the war. Chi looked up from his plate, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He saved mine first. It was an even trade. He never told me that part, Kathleen said, curious now. What happened? Chi set down his fork and seemed to consider whether to speak. Finally, he said, It was during a battle near Santa Fe. I was scouting for the American forces. My people had decided to ally with them against the Mexicans, who had been raiding our villages for years. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. I was captured by Mexican soldiers. They planned to hang me as a spy. Your father was a lieutenant then. He led a small group that ambushed the Mexicans and freed me. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 2 weeks later, his unit was ambushed in a canyon. I tracked them, warned them in time. That is when he said we were even. That sounds like my father, Kathleen said softly. He believed in debts paid and obligations honored. He was a good man, Chi agreed. One of the few white men who saw me as a person, not just an Indian. Is that why you agreed to work for him? Kathleen asked. Because of what happened in the war? Chi considered the question. Partly, but also because I had nowhere else to go. He met her eyes directly. My people call me between worlds man. Too educated for the tribe, too Indian for the whites. Your father offered a place where that didn't matter. The admission touched Kathleen deeply. It was the most personal thing Chi had ever shared with her, a glimpse of the man behind the careful reserve. Well, it doesn't matter here either, she said firmly. Not to me. Something softened in Chi's expression, a warmth that made Kathleen's heart beat faster, but he merely nodded and returned to his meal. After dinner, Chi rose to his feet. I'll check the livestock before turning in. Kathleen nodded, watching as he pulled on his coat and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Only when the door closed behind him did she allow her shoulders to slump, her careful composure to falter. She knew she should send him away. A respectable woman wouldn't keep an unmarried man on her property, especially not an Apache. But the thought of facing this wilderness alone, of waking each morning to silence unbroken by his quiet presence, filled her with a dread greater than any concern for her reputation. Later, as she lay in her bed listening to the wind's mournful song, Kathleen heard Chi's footsteps on the porch below. Not coming inside, he slept in the small storage room attached to the barn, but keeping watch, as he did each night before retiring. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and told herself the warmth spreading through her chest was merely gratitude, nothing more. Nothing more dangerous than that. The storm arrived as Chi had predicted 3 days later. It came with a fury that shook the cabin's timbers and buried the lower windows in drifts of snow. For 2 days they existed in a world of white and grey, the boundaries between earth and sky disappearing in the blizzard's rage. On the third morning, Kathleen woke to silence. The howling wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a transformed landscape. She dressed quickly, the cold air raising goosebumps on her skin despite the fire she'd banked the night before. When she opened the door, she found Chi already there, clearing a path through snow that reached past his knees. "Good morning," she called, her breath visible in the crystal air. He paused, leaning on the shovel. Something in his gaze made her suddenly conscious of her appearance, hair hastily pinned, her mother's old woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "You should stay inside," he said. "It's too cold." "I need to help with the animals," she countered, pulling on her father's old coat. It swallowed her frame but provided blessed warmth. Chi shook his head but didn't argue. He knew her well enough by now to recognize the futility. The hunt they'd planned before the storm had yielded a decent haul, 2 rabbits and a small deer, enough meat to last them for weeks, properly preserved. Kathleen had helped Chi dress the carcasses, her hands steady despite the cold. She'd grown up watching her father perform these tasks and had long since overcome any squeamishness. Now, as they worked side by side in the barn, their bodies releasing clouds of steam in the frigid air, as they fed the 2 milk cows, the horses, and the small flock of chickens that had survived the autumn. The routine was familiar, comforting in its necessity. "We lost one of the hens," Chi said, holding out the stiff body of a chicken that had succumbed to the cold. Kathleen sighed. "That's the 3rd this winter." She took the bird from him, their gloved hands briefly touching. "At least it won't go to waste. We can have stew tonight." As she turned away, Kathleen caught sight of something on the back wall of the barn, a small bundle hung from a nail. Feathers and beads were woven into an intricate pattern, unfamiliar symbols painted in earthy colors. "What is that?" she asked, though she knew it hadn't been there the day before. Chi followed her gaze, his expression unchanging. "Medicine bundle. For protection." "Protection from what?" He met her eyes. Bad spirits in the storm. Kathleen had never heard him speak of such things before. Her parents had raised her in the Christian faith, though they'd been more flexible in their beliefs than many settlers. Her father had often said that God spoke in many languages to many peoples. "Do you believe in such things?" she asked carefully. Spirits in the storm? Something flickered in his dark eyes. I believe in respecting what I don't understand. It was a diplomatic answer, and Kathleen found herself wanting more. In these months together, she realized she knew so little about him beyond his skills and his work ethic. Would you tell me about it? She asked, gesturing toward the bundle. If you don't mind. Chi studied her face, as if searching for mockery or condescension. Finding none, he moved closer to the bundle, his fingers lightly touching the feathers. This is eagle feather, he explained, for strength and wisdom. These are owl, for seeing through darkness. The red paint is sacred, made from earth that my grandmother showed me how to find. His voice softened slightly. She was a medicine woman of our tribe. And the symbols? Kathleen asked, genuinely interested. This one means protection. Chi traced a circular design with his finger. This one calls to the spirits of the ancestors. This asks for harmony between all things. It's beautiful, Kathleen said sincerely. Thank you for showing me. For a moment, something warm and unguarded passed between them. A simple connection, human to human. Then Chi stepped back, resuming his practical demeanor. The path to the woodshed needs clearing, he said. I'll do that next. I'll help, Kathleen insisted, following him out into the transformed world. They worked together through the morning, clearing paths to the essential outbuildings, checking for damage from the storm. The sun emerged occasionally from behind clouds, turning the blanket of snow into a sea of diamonds. Despite the bitter cold, there was a stark beauty to the landscape that took Kathleen's breath away. I've never seen it like this, she said, pausing to rest her arms. So still, so white. Chi stopped working, following her gaze across the valley below, where every tree and rock was transformed by snow. The Apache call this ghost moon time, he said, when the world sleeps beneath the white blanket. Ghost moon time, Kathleen repeated, liking the sound of it. That's perfect. A rare smile flickered across Chi's face, there and gone like a mirage. But Kathleen caught it, and the sight warmed her more than any fire could have done. By midday, they'd cleared all the necessary paths and checked the animals again. The cold had deepened as the sun climbed higher, the air crystalline and sharp in their lungs. My father said you fought with him in the war, she ventured as they made their way back to the cabin. That's how you learned English so well. Chi's face closed slightly, but he nodded. Your father was a good man. He treated me with respect when others didn't. Where were you before? I mean, before you came to work for us. The question had been bothering her for some time. Chi was clearly educated, spoke excellent English, and possessed skills beyond those of a simple laborer. Yet here he was, working on an isolated homestead for little more than room and board. Many places. His gaze drifted to the barn door, to the white world beyond. I scouted for the army for a time, worked on ranches, trapped in the mountains. But you never stayed anywhere long. A slight shrug. I wasn't welcome to stay. The simple statement contained volumes of untold stories, and Kathleen felt a pang of sympathy. She knew something of being unwelcome, the look she received in town when she rode in alone, the whispers behind fans at church about that poor Benson girl who'd gone peculiar after her parents died. Well, you're welcome here, she said firmly, for as long as you want to stay. Chi studied her face as if searching for the truth behind her words. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded once before returning to his tasks. Later that evening, as the temperature plummeted further, Kathleen found herself staring at the small cot in the corner of the main room. It was where her father had slept when her mother was alive, allowing Kathleen the privacy of the loft. After their deaths, she'd moved downstairs, unable to bear the emptiness of their bedroom. With the storm's bitter cold settling into every corner of the cabin, she couldn't in good conscience leave Chi in the uninsulated storage room where he usually slept. When he came to the door that night, bringing the last load of firewood before dark, Kathleen made her decision. It's too cold for you to sleep in the storage room, she said, the words coming out in a rush. You should stay in here tonight, by the fire. Chi went very still, his eyes moving from her face to the small I have blankets. The storage room is sufficient. It's going to be 20 below tonight. You'll freeze out there. For a moment, she thought he might refuse again, but then he gave a small nod. I'll bring my bedroll. I can sleep on the floor. The cot! The floor, he repeated, and Kathleen understood this was concession to. Even here, miles from the nearest neighbor, some boundaries could not be crossed. She busied herself with preparations for dinner, while Chi went to retrieve his few belongings from the storage room. When he returned, he brought with him not only his bedroll, but also a small leather pouch which he placed carefully on the table. Kathleen's curiosity got the better of her. "What's that?" Instead of answering, Chi opened the pouch and removed a tarnished silver pocket watch. He held it out to her, and after a moment's hesitation, Kathleen took it. The metal was warm from being carried close to his body. "It was your father's," Chi explained. "He gave it to me before he died. Asked me to keep it safe until you were settled." Kathleen stared at the watch, running her thumb over the worn surface. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" "He made me promise to wait. Said you would need time." Chi paused, his voice softening. "He asked me to look after you, to stay until you didn't need me anymore." The revelation struck Kathleen like a physical blow. All these months she'd believed Chi had stayed out of some sense of obligation to her father's memory, or perhaps simply because he had nowhere else to go. The idea that he remained because of a deathbed promise that her father had arranged for her protection even as he lay dying brought tears to her eyes. "He knew I wouldn't accept charity," she murmured, still staring at the watch. "That's why he kept you on as a worker instead of a guardian." Chi nodded. "Your father understood pride." The watch ticked steadily in her palm, a familiar sound she hadn't heard since her father's death. The last tangible connection to the man who had raised her to be strong and independent. "He spoke of you often during his final days," Chi continued, his voice low. "Worried about leaving you alone. I promised him I would stay as long as needed." "What were his last words?" Kathleen asked, suddenly desperate to know. She had been away when her father died, having gone to fetch medicine from town. By the time she'd returned, he was already gone. Chi's expression softened. He said, "Tell my daughter she is stronger than she knows. Tell her I am proud of the woman she has become." Tears welled in Kathleen's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. Chi looked away, giving her a moment to compose herself. "Thank you for telling me," Kathleen said finally, closing her fingers around the timepiece, "and for keeping your promise to him." "I will keep it as long as necessary," Chi said quietly. Their eyes met across the small space, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that connected them, fragile yet enduring as a thread of silver in the darkness. That night, with the temperature falling to depths that froze the moisture on the inside of the windows, Kathleen lay awake, listening to Chi's steady breathing from his place on the floor. The fire cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls, and outside, the vast New Mexico wilderness stood silent under its blanket of snow. For the first time since her parents died, Kathleen felt the acute ache of loneliness begin to ease, replaced by something she wasn't ready to name. January arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it the coldest days Kathleen could remember. The world beyond the cabin windows remained locked in ice, the sun a pale disk that offered light but little warmth. Inside, she and Chi developed a careful routine, sharing meals, dividing chores, existing in a bubble of forced intimacy, yet maintaining the invisible boundaries that propriety demanded. Chi continued to sleep on the floor of the main room each night, rising before dawn to rekindle the fire. Kathleen pretended not to notice how he sometimes watched her when she read by lamplight, or the way his hand occasionally lingered near hers when she passed him a cup of coffee. The days often stretched long and quiet, filled with necessary tasks, but little else to occupy their minds. To pass the evenings, Kathleen had begun reading aloud from the small collection of books her father had accumulated over the years. Chi never commented on the stories, but she could tell he was listening by the way his hands would still on whatever task occupied them. One evening, as snow pattered softly against the windows, Kathleen closed the book she'd been reading, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets that had belonged to her mother. "Did your people have stories?" she asked impulsively. "Like these, I mean. Tales that were passed down." Chi looked up from the arrowhead he was crafting, surprise flickering across his features. "Many stories," he said after a moment. "Our history was not written in books, but carried in memory and shared through words." "Would you tell me one?" Kathleen asked, genuinely curious. "If it's not forbidden." Chi set aside his work, considering her request. "Some stories are sacred, meant only for certain ears," he said finally. "But others are for teaching for all to hear." He shifted, settling more comfortably by the fire. "I could tell you about Coyote and how the stars were placed in the sky." Kathleen nodded eagerly, setting aside her book. Chi's voice changed as he began the tale, taking on a rhythmic quality she'd never heard before. He spoke of Coyote, the trickster who stole a bag of stars from the Creator and scattered them carelessly across the night sky, creating the constellations. His hands moved occasionally to illustrate parts of the story, and Kathleen found herself entranced not just by the tale but by this new side of him, more animated, less guarded. When he finished, silence fell between them, comfortable and warm as the firelight. "That was beautiful," Kathleen said finally. "Thank you for sharing it." "My grandmother told me that story when I was very small," Chi replied, a distant look in his eyes. "She knew hundreds of tales about the mountains, the animals, the first people. When she died, many of those stories died with her." There was such profound loss in his voice that Kathleen's heart ached for him. "Tell me about her," she encouraged gently. "Your grandmother." Chi was silent for so long that Kathleen thought he might not answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. She was a small woman, but her presence filled a room. Her hands were always moving, weaving baskets, grinding corn, mixing medicines. She could read the sky better than any man in our tribe, could tell when rain would come by the smell of the wind. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She had no patience for foolishness. Once, when I was 12 and thought myself a warrior, I disobeyed her and went hunting alone. I fell and broke my arm. She set the bone without a word, then made me scrape hides for 3 weeks, broken arm and all. "Learn to listen before you learn to hunt," she said. Kathleen smiled at the story, imagining a young Chi, proud and headstrong, being put in his place by a determined grandmother. "What was her name?" she asked. "Nalin. It means air or breeze in our language." Chi's expression softened with memory. "She taught me to read the white man's books in secret, said knowledge was a weapon sharper than any knife." "She sounds remarkable," Kathleen said. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have liked you," Chi replied, and the simple statement felt like a profound compliment. The conversation drifted to other topics, Kathleen sharing memories of her own grandmother who had taught her to quilt and bake bread, Chi describing the desert landscapes where he'd spent his early childhood. For the first time they spoke not as employer and worker, but as two people with shared experiences of love and loss. It was during one of these bitter evenings, with the wind screaming across the chimney like a wounded animal, that their fragile equilibrium finally shattered. Kathleen had been mending one of her father's old shirts, now worn by Chi, whose broader shoulders had stretched the fabric at the seams, when she pricked her finger deeply with the needle. A bright bead of blood welled up, and she gasped at the sudden sharp pain. Before she could reach for a handkerchief, Chi was beside her, taking her hand in his. The contact was so unexpected that Kathleen went still, her breath catching in her throat. "Let me see," he said, his voice low. He examined the small wound with such concentration that Kathleen found herself studying his face instead. The strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the long lashes that framed his dark eyes. She had never allowed herself to look at him so openly before. Chi rose and went to his pack, returning with a small tin. Inside was a greenish salve that smelled of pine and herbs. "It will stop the bleeding and prevent infection," he explained, applying a small amount to her finger with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," Kathleen said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Where did you learn about medicines?" "My grandmother was a healer." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "She taught me many things before the soldiers came." It was the most personal information he had ever volunteered, and Kathleen seized the opportunity. "What happened with the soldiers?" The almost smile vanished. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sat back on his heels, still holding her hand. "I was 14, old enough to fight," my father said, but my grandmother disagreed. She sent me to the high caves with the young children when the bluecoats came. His voice remained steady, but Kathleen felt a slight tension in his fingers. "When I returned, there was nothing left. No one left." Kathleen's throat tightened. "Your family?" "All gone." He released her hand and stood. "That's when I learned English. Decided to survive in the white man's world since mine was gone." "I'm sorry," Kathleen whispered, knowing the words were inadequate. Chi moved toward the fire, adding another log. The flames illuminated half his face, leaving the other in shadow. It was a long time ago. Is that why you left your tribe? Because they reminded you of what you'd lost? He turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. You ask difficult questions. You don't have to answer. No. Chi ran a hand through his hair, longer now than when he'd first come to work for her father. I left because I no longer belonged. I had learned too many white ways, spoke too much English. The elders said I had lost my spirit. Kathleen set aside her sewing. Do you believe that's true? Sometimes. His eyes met hers. But not here. Here, I remember who I am. There was something in his voice that made her heart beat faster. A current of meaning beneath the simple words. And who is that? She asked softly. Chi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room and knelt before her chair, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Someone who has watched you grieve, he said finally. Someone who has seen your strength, your courage. He hesitated, then added, Someone who sees you, Kathleen Benson. No one had spoken her name like that before, like it was something precious, something to be savored. The sound of it on his lips made her shiver. Chi, she began, but didn't know how to continue. What could she say that wouldn't cross the line they'd both been so careful to maintain? A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. The sudden flare of light seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over them. Chi rose to his feet and stepped back. It's late, he said. You should rest. Kathleen nodded, grateful for the reprieve, yet oddly disappointed. She gathered her sewing and moved toward the ladder that led to the loft, where she'd taken to sleeping again once Chi had begun staying in the main room. At the foot of the ladder, she paused. Chi? He looked up from where he was spreading his bedroll near the fire. Thank you, she said, for telling me about your family, for seeing me. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire's glow. Sleep well, Kathleen. Later, lying in her bed beneath layers of quilts, Kathleen stared into the darkness and allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been fighting for months. The flutter in her chest when Chi spoke her name, the awareness that hummed through her body when he was near, the way she found herself watching him when he didn't notice, memorizing the slope of his shoulders, the grace of his movements. It was more than gratitude or dependency, more dangerous than either. It was desire. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, it settled into her bones with the inevitability of night following day, as if some part of her had always known, had been waiting for her conscious mind to catch up. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song. Inside, Kathleen's heart beat a new rhythm, one she could no longer pretend not to hear. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Sunshine sparkled on the vast expanse of snow, turning the world into a sea of diamonds. The beauty was breathtaking, but it was the break in the weather that truly lifted Kathleen's spirits. For the first time in weeks, they might be able to make the journey into town for supplies. When she descended from the loft, she found Chi already dressed for the outdoors, pulling on heavy gloves. I'm going to check the trail, he said, nodding toward the window. See if we can get the wagon through to town. I'll come with you, Kathleen decided, reaching for her coat. They trudged through the snow together, following what had once been the road leading from their property to the main trail. The drifts were deep in places, but the underlying ground was visible in others where the wind had swept the snow away. It might be possible, Chi said after they'd gone about half a mile. Not with the wagon, but with horses. We could take the pack horse for supplies. Kathleen nodded, squinting against the glare of sun on snow. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should check for mail. There might be news from my aunt in Santa Fe. They turned back toward the cabin, walking side by side. The only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional call of a bird. The silence between them was different now, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. About last night, Kathleen began, her courage bolstered by the open sky above them. You don't need to say anything, Chi interrupted gently. I do. She stopped walking, forcing him to do the same. What you said about seeing me, I want you to know that I see you too. The words hung in the cold air between them. Chi's expression remained carefully neutral, but something kindled in his eyes. Kathleen. Just her name, but it contained a warning, a question, a plea. I know it's impossible, she continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. I know what people would say, what they already say. But here, in these mountains, with no one to judge us but ourselves." She faltered, suddenly uncertain. Chi took a step closer. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to pretend anymore." Kathleen met his gaze steadily, despite the hammering of her heart. "I don't want to ignore what's happening between us." For a long moment, Chi didn't move. Then slowly he raised a hand to her face. His gloved fingers traced the curve of her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "There can be no going back from this," he said softly. "Are you certain?" Instead of answering with words, Kathleen closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative but quickly deepened. Chi's arms came around her, pulling her against him as if he'd been waiting a lifetime to hold her. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Chi rested his forehead against hers. "We should return to the cabin," he murmured. The journey back passed in a blur. Inside, with the door closed against the world, they came together again, this time without hesitation, without the burden of pretense. Chi's hands were sure and gentle as they removed layers of clothing, his lips warm against her skin. Kathleen trembled, not from cold but from the newness of these sensations, the rightness of his touch. "I've wanted this since summer," he confessed against her neck. "Watching you tend your garden, so strong, so beautiful." "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. "It wasn't my place." His eyes searched hers. "And I was afraid you would send me away." "Never," Kathleen whispered. "I need you too much." They moved to the bed, her bed now, brought down from the loft the previous week when the cold had become too intense. And there, in the gentle light of a winter morning, they discovered each other fully. Chi's body was lean and powerful, marked with scars that told stories of his hard life. Kathleen's was soft in comparison, but strong from months of work and survival. Afterward, lying in the warmth of his embrace, Kathleen felt no shame, no regret, only a profound sense of peace. As if some part of her that had been adrift had finally found its anchor. "What happens now?" she asked, tracing patterns on his chest. Chi's fingers combed gently through her unbound hair. "Now we live, one day at a time." It seemed so simple when he said it that way. But Kathleen knew the reality would be far more complicated. They might be isolated now, protected by winter's embrace. But eventually, spring would come. With it would come visitors, interactions with the town, the weight of society's judgment. Yet for this moment, in the cocoon of their cabin, with the winter sun streaming through frost-covered windows, none of that mattered. There was only this, Chi's heartbeat beneath her palm, the sound of his breathing, the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. In the days that followed, they settled into a new rhythm. They worked together as they always had, but now there were stolen touches, shared glances that spoke volumes, nights spent wrapped in each other's arms rather than separated by the width of a room. Kathleen found herself smiling more often, humming as she worked. Even Chi seemed lighter somehow, the perpetual wariness in his eyes softened by something that looked remarkably like happiness. Their journey to town had to wait another week, until the snow had melted enough to make the trails passable. When they finally set out, mounted on the steady horses that had carried them through many a winter journey, Kathleen felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "We don't have to go together," Chi said, reading her expression. "I can wait at the edge of town." "No," Kathleen said firmly. "I won't hide what we are to each other." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. They would have to be discreet in town, maintain the fiction of employer and worker for their own safety. Chi seemed to understand the unspoken part of her statement. "I'll follow your lead," he said simply. The town appeared much as it always did, a scattering of wooden buildings along a muddy main street, smoke rising from chimneys, horses tied at hitching posts. As they rode in, Kathleen felt the familiar weight of eyes upon them, the momentary lull in conversations as people noticed their arrival. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, channeling the quiet dignity her father had always shown in the face of judgment or adversity. Beside her, Chi remained impassive, his expression giving away nothing of their changed relationship. Their first stop was the general store, where Mr. Daniels greeted them with his usual forced politeness. Kathleen handed over her list of supplies, while Chi remained near the door, his hat in his hands, the picture of a respectful employee. "Quite the storm we had," Daniels commented as he gathered her items. "Must have been difficult up on that mountain of yours." "We managed," Kathleen replied simply. "Sheriff Marshall was concerned about you," Daniels continued, his eyes darting to Chi and back. "Said he'd offered to escort you to town before the weather turned, but you declined." "I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, Mr. Daniels." Kathleen kept her tone pleasant but firm. "And Chi is an excellent worker. We had everything we needed." Daniels made a non-committal sound and continued collecting her supplies. As he did, the bell above the door jingled, announcing new customers. Kathleen turned to see Mrs. Peterson enter, accompanied by her daughter, and, to her dismay, Jacob Mercer. "Why, Miss Benson, Mrs. Peterson exclaimed with that same false surprise she always affected. "How wonderful to see you survived the blizzard. We were all so worried." "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Peterson," Kathleen replied coolly. "As you can see, we're quite well." Jacob Mercer stepped forward, his tall frame blocking the sunlight from the window. He was a handsome man, in a conventional way, with a prosperous air about him that spoke of his success as a rancher. But there was a calculating coldness in his eyes that had always put Kathleen on edge. "Miss Benson," he said, tipping his hat, "you're looking well, despite the hardships of winter." His gaze flickered to Chi and narrowed slightly. "I see your hired hand is still with you." Chi gave no indication he'd heard the slight emphasis Mercer placed on the words, but Kathleen felt a flare of anger on his behalf. "Yes, Mr. Mercer, I'm fortunate to have such reliable help." She turned back to Daniels. "Will that be all, Mr. Daniels? We have several other errands to complete before heading back." "Actually, Miss Benson," Mercer interjected before Daniels could answer, "I was hoping to have a word with you, in private." The last thing Kathleen wanted was to be alone with Jacob Mercer, but causing a scene would only fuel the town gossip. She glanced at Chi, who gave her an imperceptible nod. "Very well, Mr. Mercer, but I can only spare a few minutes." They stepped outside onto the store's covered porch. The day had warmed somewhat, the sun high in a cloudless sky, but the air still held the crisp edge of winter. "I'll come straight to the point, Miss Benson," Mercer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I'm still interested in purchasing your property. The offer I made after your father's passing still stands. In fact, I'm prepared to increase it by 20%. Kathleen blinked in surprise. It was a generous offer, far more than the land was worth by any reasonable assessment. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why is my property so valuable to you?" Mercer smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have plans for expanding my holdings in that direction. The water rights alone make it worthwhile." Kathleen considered his words. Her father had often spoken of the value of their spring-fed creek, a reliable source of water even in the driest summers. Water was life in this territory, and control of it meant power. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Mercer," she said firmly. "Not at any price." His smile faded, replaced by a harder expression. "Miss Benson, be reasonable. A woman alone can't possibly maintain 40 acres, especially in those mountains." "I'm managing quite well," Kathleen replied evenly. "For now, perhaps," Mercer conceded. "But what about when the money runs out, or when that Indian of yours decides he's had enough of playing the dutiful servant?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "People talk, you know. Living alone with him isn't proper." A chill ran down Kathleen's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What are you implying, Mr. Mercer?" "Only that appearances matter in a community like ours," he said smoothly. "Your father was respected, but that goodwill only extends so far. If you continue down this path," he let the sentence hang unfinished, the threat implicit. "My choices are my own," Kathleen said, anger making her voice sharper than she intended. "And I choose to keep my land." Mercer straightened, his expression hardening further. "You might want to reconsider. Times are changing in the territory. The army's bringing in more troops to deal with the Apache problem. It would be a shame if your worker got caught up in something unpleasant." The barely veiled threat made Kathleen's blood run cold, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "Good day, Mr. Mercer," she said, turning to go back inside. His hand on her arm stopped her. "Think about my offer, Miss Benson. It won't remain open indefinitely." She pulled her arm free, meeting his gaze directly. "Don't threaten me, Mr. Mercer. My father taught me many things. including how to use a rifle. With that, she returned to the store, her heart pounding. Chi looked up as she entered, his eyes immediately searching her face. She gave a slight shake of her head. Not here, not now. They completed their errands in tense silence, collecting mail at the post office, visiting the blacksmith to arrange for repairs to their plough come spring. Throughout it all, Kathleen felt the weight of eyes upon them, the whispers that followed in their wake. It was only when they were well away from town, the trail climbing back toward their mountain sanctuary, that she finally told Chi about Mercer's offer and his veiled threats. "He wants the water," Chi said, nodding thoughtfully. "I suspected as much. The creek on your land feeds into the valley where his cattle graze. In a dry year, controlling that water would make him even more powerful." "He threatened you," Kathleen said, the fear she'd suppressed in town finally showing in her voice. "Talked about troops coming to deal with the Apache problem." Chi's expression remained impassive, but she saw the slight tightening of his jaw. "Not surprising. Mercer has connections at Fort Craig. His brother-in-law is an officer there." "What should we do?" Kathleen asked, hating the helplessness she felt. "For now, nothing," Chi replied. "Mercer is dangerous, but he's also cautious. He won't move against us directly. Too much risk to his reputation, but we should be vigilant." They rode in silence for a time, each lost in thought. Finally, Chi spoke again, his voice gentler than before. "Kathleen, if you wanted to sell, to make a different life somewhere else, I would understand." She reined her horse to a stop, turning to face him fully. "Is that what you think I want, to run away?" "I think," he said carefully, "that loving me will make your life harder than it needs to be. And easier than it would be without you," she countered fiercely. "This land is my home. Our home. I won't let Mercer or anyone else drive us from it." Something softened in Chi's expression, pride perhaps, or simply love. "Then we stay," he said, "and we prepare." As they continued their journey home, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains, Kathleen felt a renewed determination building within her. Yes, there would be challenges ahead. Yes, there would be those who sought to separate them, to take what was theirs. But together, they were stronger than any force that might come against them. The cabin came into view as they crested the final ridge, nestled among the pines, smoke rising from the chimney where the banked fire still smoldered. Their sanctuary, their fortress against the world. "Home," Kathleen said softly. Beside her, Chi nodded, his eyes on the same sight. "Home," he agreed, and in that single word was a promise neither needed to speak aloud. Whatever came, they would face it together. The transformation came gradually with the spring thaw. Snow receded from the mountain slopes, revealing patches of earth that had lain dormant through the long winter. Streams swelled with meltwater, their voices changing from whispers to shouts as they carved new paths down to the valley. Inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation had taken place. The careful distance Kathleen and Chi had maintained for so long had dissolved entirely, replaced by an intimacy that grew deeper with each passing day. They spoke freely now, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams of their futures. At night, they slept entwined, finding in each other's arms a sanctuary neither had known before. It was a fragile happiness, built on the foundation of their isolation. Both understood that the outside world would soon intrude, bringing with it complications they had temporarily forgotten. That reckoning came sooner than expected. April had just begun to paint the landscape with the first tentative greens when Kathleen spotted riders approaching from the valley trail. She was in the garden turning soil for planting, while Chi repaired a section of fence nearby. "Someone's coming," she called, shading her eyes against the spring sunshine. Chi straightened, his body tensing as he followed her gaze. 3 riders. One of them is Marshall. Kathleen felt a knot form in her stomach. Sheriff Marshall had made his disapproval clear the last time she'd been in town, suggesting none too subtly that a woman alone with that Indian was asking for trouble. "We knew this would happen eventually," she said, moving to stand beside Chi. On impulse, she took his hand, squeezing it once before letting go. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." Chi's expression remained impassive, but she knew him well enough now to recognize the concern in his eyes. "Be careful what you say to them." The riders drew closer, and Kathleen recognized not only Sheriff Marshall, but also Reverend Townsend from the church in town, and Jacob Mercer, whose large cattle ranch bordered her property to the south. "Miss Benson," Marshall called as they approached, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Good to see you survived the winter." "Sheriff," Kathleen nodded, deliberately not extending the courtesy to her other unwelcome visitors. "What brings you all the way up here?" The three men dismounted, and Kathleen noted how their eyes darted to Chi, who stood a few paces behind her, his stance relaxed but watchful. "Thought we'd check on you, ma'am," Marshall said, though his tone suggested this was no casual social call. "There's been more trouble with renegade Apaches to the west. 3 homesteads burned last month." "I've heard nothing of this," Kathleen said, crossing her arms. Reverend Townsend stepped forward, his thin face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "We're concerned for your safety, Miss Benson. Living out here alone with—" He glanced meaningfully at Chi. "I'm not alone," Kathleen replied evenly. "And Chi has worked this land for nearly 2 years now. My father trusted him completely." Jacob Mercer snorted. "Your father was a good man, but he had some peculiar notions about Indians. Respectfully, Miss Benson, you might not fully understand the danger." "I understand perfectly well, Mr. Mercer." Kathleen lifted her chin. "What I don't understand is why 3 grown men have ridden all this way when there's been no trouble here." Marshall exchanged glances with the other men. "Thing is, Miss Benson, we've had some concerns raised in town about your situation." "My situation," she repeated flatly. "A young unmarried woman living alone with a man. Any man would raise eyebrows," Reverend Townsend interjected. "But given the circumstances—" "What the Reverend is trying to say," Mercer cut in, "is that you're risking more than your safety. Your reputation in the community—" "My reputation?" Kathleen felt heat rising to her face. "I wasn't aware that my reputation was any concern of yours, Mr. Mercer." The rancher had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Your father and I did business together for many years. I feel a certain responsibility. The only responsibility you have is to respect my property and my choices," Kathleen interrupted. "Now, unless you have actual business with me, I suggest you be on your way." Sheriff Marshall's expression hardened. "Miss Benson, we're trying to help you. These attacks are real, and having an Apache on your land might make you a target." "Or it might be that having Chi here is the reason my home hasn't been troubled," Kathleen countered. "Have you considered that?" A tense silence followed her words. Finally, Chi spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Sheriff, I understand your concern, but I have no connection to those responsible for the attacks. My loyalty is here." His eyes briefly met Kathleen's before returning to Marshall. "I would give my life to protect this land and its mistress." Something in his tone, the quiet intensity of it, seemed to give the sheriff pause. "That may be so," Marshall said after a moment. "But intentions aside, your presence here complicates matters." Mercer stepped closer to Kathleen, lowering his voice. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Benson. My offer to purchase your land still stands, at a fair price. You could move into town, perhaps stay with Mrs. Whitaker until you decide what's next." Kathleen stared at him, suddenly understanding. "This isn't about my safety at all, is it? This is about my land." "Now that's unfair," Mercer protested, but the flush creeping up his neck told another story. "My father refused to sell to you while he was alive," Kathleen continued, anger giving her words a sharp edge. "Did you think I'd be more easily persuaded? That a few veiled threats about Apache raids would send me running to town?" Reverend Townsend held up his hands placatingly. "Miss Benson, no one is threatening you." "We're genuinely concerned. I think you should leave," Kathleen said, cutting him off. "All of you." For a moment it seemed Marshall might argue further, but something in her expression, or perhaps Chi's silent presence at her back, changed his mind. "Very well," the sheriff said stiffly, "but consider what we've said. Times are changing in the territory. The army's bringing in more troops to deal with the Apache problem. It would be a shame if—" he glanced at Chi— "if misunderstandings occurred." The threat, however veiled, hung in the air between them. Kathleen felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "Good day, gentlemen," she said firmly. They mounted their horses and rode away, dust rising behind them in the clear spring air. Only when they were well down the trail did Kathleen allow her shoulders to slump, the tension draining from her body. "They'll be back," Chi said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I know." She turned to face him, searching his eyes. What did Marshall mean about the army bringing in more troops? There's a new commander at Fort Craig, General Howard. He's known for his campaigns against the Chiricahua. Chi's expression remained carefully neutral. The peace we've had is fragile. Are you in danger? The thought made her blood run cold. We're both in danger, he corrected gently. What we have, what we are to each other. It threatens them. Kathleen knew he was right. In the months since they'd first come together, they had created their own world within the confines of the homestead, a world where the differences between them mattered less than the bond they shared. But that world existed in defiance of the larger one beyond their boundaries. I won't let them separate us, she said fiercely. This is my land, my life. Chi touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. Kathleen Benson, still so brave. Not brave, she corrected, just stubborn. His rare smile flashed briefly. That too. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Kathleen felt Chi's restlessness. His body was tense beside hers, his breathing too measured to be natural. Tell me what you're thinking, she murmured, her hand finding his beneath the covers. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally he turned to face her, his features barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. I'm thinking that I should leave, he said, the words clearly painful for him to speak. Before I bring trouble to your door. Kathleen sat up, suddenly fully awake. No, absolutely not. Listen to me, Chi said, rising to a sitting position beside her. Marshall was right about one thing. My presence here makes you a target. Not just for Apache raids, but for men like Mercer who want your land. So I should just surrender? Let them win? Kathleen shook her head vehemently. My father didn't raise me to back down from a fight. This isn't about fighting, Chi said, taking her hands in his. It's about survival. Your survival. My survival isn't worth much without you, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. These past months, they've been the first time I've truly felt alive since my parents died. You can't ask me to go back to just existing. Chi pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart, the slight tremor in his hands as they stroked her hair. I love you, he said, the words so quiet she almost didn't hear them. It was the first time either of them had spoken it aloud, though the feeling had been growing between them for months. That's why I can't be selfish. I can't put you at risk. Kathleen pulled back enough to see his face. Loving me isn't selfish, and leaving wouldn't protect me, it would destroy me. She cupped his face between her palms. We'll find a way. Together. Later, as Chi finally slept beside her, Kathleen stared into the darkness. She knew the threat was real, had seen it in Marshall's eyes, in Mercer's barely concealed greed. But she also knew, with bone-deep certainty, that losing Chi would be a wound from which she might never recover. There had to be a solution, a path forward that allowed them to stay together without living in constant fear. She just hadn't found it yet. She thought back to all her father had taught her about survival in this harsh land. Thomas Benson had been a pragmatic man who believed in preparation, in meeting challenges head-on rather than waiting for them to overwhelm you. When the storm's coming, Katie girl, he'd often told her, you don't hide and hope it passes by. You secure what matters most and face it with your eyes open. What mattered most was Chi, their life together, the love that had grown between them against all odds. How could she secure that? What weapon did she have against the prejudice and greed that threatened to tear them apart? The answer came to her slowly, forming in her mind as the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the window. It was a radical solution, one that might scandalize the town even further, but it could also provide the legal protection they desperately needed. Marriage. The very thought made her breath catch. Could it even be done? Would any minister in the territory perform such a ceremony? And would it truly protect them, or merely paint an even larger target on their backs? She had no answers yet, but for the first time in days, Kathleen felt the stirrings of hope. When Chi woke beside her, she would share her thoughts with him. Together they would find a way forward, not just to survive, but to build a life worthy of the love they'd found in each other. Morning brought no easy answers, but it did bring a new development. As Kathleen stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee, she spotted a rider approaching, a single figure moving at an unhurried pace up the mountain trail. She called for Chi, who emerged from the barn wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you recognize them?" she asked, straining to make out details in the distance. Chi shaded his eyes, then shook his head. Not Marshall or the others from yesterday. They waited side by side as the rider drew closer. Eventually, Kathleen recognized the blue uniform of an army officer, the insignia of a captain visible on his shoulders. "What would the army want with us?" she murmured, unease prickling along her spine. "Wait here," Chi said, moving to intercept the rider before he reached the cabin. Kathleen ignored the instruction, following a few paces behind. She wouldn't let Chi face this alone, whatever it was. The officer reined in his horse and dismounted with the easy grace of a man accustomed to long days in the saddle. He was younger than Kathleen had expected, perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that took in Chi's defensive stance and her own wary expression. "Miss Benson?" he asked, removing his hat. "Captain James Hollister, Fort Craig." "What can I do for you, Captain?" Kathleen asked, noting how Chi had positioned himself slightly in front of her. Hollister's gaze moved to Chi, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. "Chi, isn't it? You scouted for Lieutenant Parker's company a few years back." "Yes." Chi's posture remained tense, though his expression betrayed nothing. "You were good. Parker spoke highly of you." The captain returned his attention to Kathleen. "Miss Benson, I've come with information that might concern you both. May we speak inside?" Kathleen hesitated, then nodded. Whatever this man had to say, better to hear it privately than standing in the open. In the cabin, Captain Hollister declined her offer of coffee, but accepted a seat at the small table. Chi remained standing, his back against the wall, watching the officer with careful eyes. "I'll be direct," Hollister said, placing his hat on the table. "Sheriff Marshall came to the fort yesterday, speaking of Apache troubles in the region and suggesting that certain elements might be providing information to the hostiles." "By elements, you mean Chi?" Kathleen said flatly. "That was his implication, yes." The captain's tone remained neutral. "He seemed particularly concerned about your situation here, Miss Benson." "My situation is none of his concern," she replied, anger rising. "Nor the Army's, with all due respect." Hollister held up a hand. "I'm not here to interfere. In fact, quite the opposite." He glanced at Chi. "I've known many scouts during my time in the territory. The good ones like you walk between two worlds. It's not an easy path." Chi said nothing, but Kathleen could sense his surprise. This was not the conversation either of them had expected. "General Howard has ordered increased patrols in response to the recent attacks," Hollister continued. "Some of his officers are overzealous in their approach to the Apache situation. They might not distinguish between peaceful individuals and hostiles." "You're warning us," Kathleen said, understanding dawning. The captain nodded. "Marshall and some of the local ranchers, Mercer in particular, have been pushing for action against any Apache found off the reservation. I thought you should know." "Why?" Chi asked, speaking for the first time. "Why warn us?" Hollister's expression softened slightly. "My wife is Navajo. I understand something of what you face." He turned to Kathleen. "And I knew your father, Miss Benson. He was a fair man who judged people by their character, not their heritage. I respected him for that." The revelation stunned Kathleen into momentary silence. This army officer, married to a native woman, had come to warn them out of respect for her father's memory and perhaps some sense of shared experience. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked finally. Hollister sighed. "I wish I had an easy answer. The territory is changing. The railroad's coming through the valley next year, more settlers with it. The old ways of living apart, finding your own peace." He shook his head. "It gets harder every year." "We're not leaving," Kathleen said firmly. "This is our home." The captain studied her face, then Chi's, seeming to come to some internal decision. "There might be a way to make your position more secure, legally speaking." "How?" Chi asked. "Marriage." Hollister said the word simply, without judgment. "It wouldn't solve everything. There would still be those who object, but it would give you legal standing. Protection." Kathleen felt heat rise to her face. Not from embarrassment, but from the sudden realization that this possibility, so obvious in retrospect, had never occurred to her. In her mind, marriage to Chi had seemed an impossibility. something the world would never allow. "Is that even legal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For us to marry?" "In New Mexico territory, yes. There are no laws against it here. Not yet." Hollister's expression grew grave. "That may change as we move toward statehood, but a marriage performed now would be recognized, even if later laws prohibited such unions." Chi had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Kathleen's face. She couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if the captain's suggestion horrified or relieved him. "I should leave you to discuss this privately," Hollister said, rising and retrieving his hat. "I've delivered my warning. What you do with it is your choice." Kathleen walked him to the door, her mind whirling with this new possibility. At the threshold, the captain paused. "One more thing," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "My wife and I were married by a minister in Albuquerque who's known for his progressive views, Reverend Michaels at the Methodist Church. If you decide to pursue this path, he might be willing to help." "Thank you," Kathleen said, truly grateful for this unexpected ally. "For everything." When Hollister had gone, she closed the door and turned to face Chi. He hadn't moved from his position against the wall, his expression still unreadable. "Marriage," she said, testing the word in the silence between them. "Is that what you want?" Chi asked, his voice carefully neutral. Kathleen moved closer to him, close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes. "What I want is to be with you, without fear, without hiding. If marriage makes that possible—" She hesitated, suddenly afraid she was presuming too much. "Unless you don't—" Chi pulled her into his arms, cutting off her words with a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought it would be possible," he murmured, "to have you as my wife before the law, before God." "Is that a yes?" Kathleen asked, her heart pounding. His rare smile appeared, transforming his face. "Yes. If you're certain this is what you want." "I've never been more certain of anything," she replied, and knew it for truth. 2 weeks later, Kathleen and Chi stood before Reverend Michaels in the small Methodist church in Albuquerque. The ceremony was brief and simple, witnessed only by the Reverend's wife and Captain Hollister and his Navajo wife, Emma. Kathleen wore her mother's best dress, carefully altered to fit her slimmer frame. Chi wore a new suit purchased in town, his long hair tied back neatly. They exchanged simple gold bands that had cost nearly all their saved money and vows that needed no embellishment to express what was in their hearts. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Michaels declared, genuine warmth in his voice. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Kathleen looked up into Chi's face, her husband's face, she felt a sense of rightness, of completion. The world might not understand or accept what they had found together, but they had claimed it nonetheless, made it legal, binding, recognized under the laws of man and God. "Mrs. Chi," he whispered, the name still new and strange on his lips. "Mr. Benson," she countered with a smile, having insisted that he take her surname for practical reasons. On paper, they would be Mr. and Mrs. Benson, a shield against some of the prejudice they would inevitably face. Captain Hollister approached them after the ceremony, his wife beside him. Emma Hollister was a striking woman with kind eyes and an easy smile that made Kathleen warm to her immediately. "Congratulations," the captain said, shaking Chi's hand. "I've taken the liberty of filing your marriage certificate with the territorial office. It's official and recorded." "Thank you," Chi said, genuine gratitude in his voice, "for everything you've done." Emma squeezed Kathleen's hands warmly. "The path you've chosen isn't easy," she said softly, "but the joy is worth the struggle. Remember that on the difficult days." As they prepared to leave, Reverend Michaels pulled Kathleen aside for a moment. "I've performed many weddings in my time, Miss Benson. Forgive me, Mrs. Benson," he corrected with a smile. "But rarely have I seen two people so clearly meant for each other, despite the obstacles the world places between you." "You don't disapprove?" Kathleen couldn't help asking. "Many would say what we've done is wrong." The Reverend's kind eyes crinkled at the corners. "My understanding of God's love is that it knows no boundaries of race or station. He created all peoples and pronounced them good. Who am I to question his wisdom?" His words stayed with Kathleen long after they'd left Albuquerque, a comfort in the days ahead, when they would face the judgment and prejudice of those with narrower views. That night, in a small hotel room paid for with the last of their savings, Kathleen and Chi celebrated their union in the privacy of proper walls and a real bed, luxuries their cabin didn't offer. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver patterns across the sheets, Chi traced the curve of Kathleen's shoulder with gentle fingers. "My wife," he said, wonder still evident in his voice. Kathleen smiled, nestling closer to him. "My husband." The words felt like a victory, a defiance, a promise. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them back on their mountain, they would face it together. Not as employer and worker, not as woman and hired hand, but as husband and wife, equal partners in the life they were building. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Kathleen asked softly. "The people in town?" Chi was silent for a long moment, his fingers still tracing patterns on her skin. "Some never will," he finally said, his voice gentle but honest. "But others might in time. Change comes slowly, but it does come." "Emma and Captain Hollister seem happy," Kathleen observed. "They've found a way." "They have," Chi agreed. "And they're not alone. There are others like us finding spaces between worlds." Kathleen turned in his arms to face him. "Tell me what you want," she said. "For our future." A thoughtful expression crossed Chi's face. "Peace," he said finally. "A quiet life. Perhaps—" He hesitated, then continued. "Perhaps children someday. Little ones with your smile and my eyes." The image made Kathleen's heart swell with unexpected longing. She'd never given much thought to motherhood before, but now, with Chi, the idea seemed not just possible but desirable. "I'd like that," she whispered, laying her head on his chest. "Very much." The journey back to their mountain home took 2 days, the spring road still muddy from the thaw. As they crested the final rise, the cabin came into view, nestled among the pines just as they had left it. "Home," Kathleen said, relief evident in her voice. Despite the brief joy of their wedding journey, she had worried about leaving the property unattended. Chi's arm tightened around her waist as they sat side by side on the wagon seat. "Our home," he corrected gently. The difference wasn't lost on Kathleen. What had once been her inheritance, her responsibility alone, was now truly shared. Not just in the daily work of survival, but legally, officially. The deed she had arranged to be amended in Albuquerque named them both as owners, another layer of protection against those who might try to separate them. Spring bloomed fully as April gave way to May. The garden Kathleen planted was larger this year, with Chi building additional raised beds for vegetables that would see them through the coming winter. They worked side by side, equal partners in all things, finding a rhythm that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. News of their marriage traveled quickly through the territory. Some reactions were predictable: Sheriff Marshall's thinly veiled disgust, Reverend Townsend's pointed sermon on the sanctity of bloodlines, Jacob Mercer's renewed offers to buy their land, now directed to both of them with barely concealed contempt. But there were surprises too. Mrs. Whitaker, the widow who ran the general store in town, greeted them warmly on their first visit after the wedding. "About time you made it official," she said matter-of-factly, leaving Kathleen speechless. "Your father would have approved, I think." Old Jim Cooper, the blacksmith who had always been kind to Kathleen, shook Chi's hand and called him Mr. Benson, with no trace of mockery. "Man should stand by his wife," he said gruffly. "Don't matter what anyone else thinks." These small gestures of acceptance meant more to Kathleen than she could express. They were reminders that not everyone in the world was determined to tear them apart, that there were those who could see beyond skin color to the human hearts beneath. Captain Hollister kept his promise, ensuring that army patrols gave their property wide berth. He and Emma became occasional visitors, bringing news from the fort and beyond. Through them, Kathleen and Chi learned of changes coming to the territory, the railroad's progress, new settlements being established, shifting political winds from Washington. "Statehood is coming," Hollister predicted during one such visit in late summer. "Maybe not this year or next, but soon. When it does, things will change." "For better or worse?" Kathleen asked, serving coffee on the porch where they sat enjoying the evening coolness. The captain exchanged glances with his wife. "Both most likely. Progress always brings both." Emma Hollister nodded, her dark eyes thoughtful. When I first came to live among my husband's people, I thought I would always feel like a stranger, she said. But over time I found those who could see me as I am, not just what I represent. You will find the same in time. And until then? Kathleen asked. Emma's smile was gentle. Until then, you have each other. And friends who understand your path because they walk it too. It was during this visit that Emma first noticed what Kathleen had only begun to suspect, the subtle changes in her body, the telltale signs that life had taken root within her. How long? Emma asked privately as the two women washed dishes after dinner. I'm not certain, Kathleen admitted, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. A month, perhaps 2. I haven't told Chi yet. Emma's eyes were kind. He will be overjoyed, but also afraid. Afraid? Why? Because the world can be cruel to children who straddle 2 worlds, Emma said softly. My own son faces challenges because of his mixed blood, but he also has gifts, the strength of 2 heritages, the wisdom of 2 peoples. I hadn't thought, Kathleen began, a new worry forming. Do not borrow trouble, Emma advised, taking Kathleen's hands in hers. Your child will have loving parents and a safe home. That is more than many can claim. That night, after their guests had departed, Kathleen shared her news with Chi. They sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. When she told him, his face went still with wonder, his hand gentle as it came to rest on her belly. Her child, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Our child. Are you happy? She asked, still sometimes unsure of his thoughts when he grew quiet and contemplative. His answer came not in words, but in the reverent kiss he placed first on her lips, then on her belly. That night, he worked late by lamplight, crafting a small wooden cradle decorated with symbols that Kathleen recognized from his rare stories about his people. For protection, he explained, tracing the patterns with his fingertip. And for belonging. For now, though, their mountain sanctuary remained largely unchanged. The days fell into a pleasant pattern. Work during daylight hours, quiet evenings together, nights filled with a passion that showed no signs of diminishing. They expanded the garden, repaired the barn, added a new room to the cabin that Chi insisted on building with his own hands. For the future, he said when Kathleen questioned the need, a meaningful glance at her midsection making his meaning clear. The first signs appeared as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the subtle changes in her body, the tender fullness of her breasts, the waves of nausea that greeted her each morning. By the time the first snow fell in November, there was no denying the truth. A child, Chi said, his hand gentle on the slight curve of Kathleen's belly. Wonder and uncertainty mingled in his expression. Our child. Are you happy? She asked, still sometimes unsure of his thoughts, when he grew quiet and contemplative. His answer came not in words, but in the reverent kiss he placed first on her lips, then on her belly. That night, he worked late by lamplight, crafting a small wooden cradle decorated with symbols that Kathleen recognized from his rare stories about his people. For protection, he explained, tracing the patterns with his fingertip, and for belonging. Winter passed more gently than the previous year, or perhaps it only seemed that way because they were better prepared, more secure in their life together. Kathleen's body swelled with new life, and Chi's protective instincts grew alongside their child. He insisted on taking on more of the physical labor, watching her like a hawk whenever she ventured outside. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she reminded him, though his concern touched her deeply. You carry our future, he replied simply. I would move mountains to keep you safe. As the snow deepened around their cabin, they spent long evenings planning for the child's arrival. Chi carved toys, a small horse, a bear, tiny figures that could become whatever a child's imagination desired. Kathleen sewed tiny garments from scraps of fabric, fashioning a quilt from pieces of her mother's old dresses and her father's shirts. A connection to their heritage, she explained when Chi asked about the pattern. Something to remind them of where they came from, both sides of their family. Christmas came and went, celebrated quietly with a small pine tree Chi brought in from the forest, decorated with pine cones and dried berries. They exchanged simple gifts, a new knife for Chi crafted by Jim Cooper in town, a journal bound in soft leather for Kathleen, where she could record her thoughts for their child to read someday. With the new year came increased activity from the army. Patrols passed through the valley more frequently, and rumors reached them of skirmishes with Apache bands to the west. Captain Hollister visited when he could, keeping them informed of developments that might affect them. "General Howard is under pressure from Washington to show results," he told them during a brief visit in February. "The attacks on settlements have Congress demanding action." "Are we at risk?" Kathleen asked, her hand protectively covering her swollen belly. Hollister's expression was grim but honest. "Not directly. Your marriage offers some protection, and I've made it clear to my superiors that you're peaceful settlers, not hostiles. But caution is warranted. Tensions are high." Spring arrived again, bringing with it renewal and change. The railroad reached the valley below their mountain, and with it came more settlers, more buildings, more evidence of civilization encroaching on their wilderness. "It's not all bad," Chi observed, as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. "The new doctor in town delivered Emma Hollister's baby safely last month." Kathleen rested her hands on her own belly, now prominently rounded. "Are you suggesting I might need his services?" "I'm suggesting we have options," Chi replied, his arm steady around her shoulders. "Your mother delivered you here on this mountain, but times are changing. We can change with them when it benefits us." His wisdom has always proved sound. When Kathleen's labor began in late May, earlier than expected and progressing with alarming speed, Chi made the decision to take her to town. The journey down the mountain in the wagon was agonizing, each jolt sending waves of pain through her body. But Chi's steady presence kept her anchored. "Stay with me," she gasped, clutching his hand as another contraction seized her. "Always," he promised, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Always, my heart." Dr. Wilson's clinic was small but clean, his manner professional and to Kathleen's relief without judgment. When he hesitated at Chi's refusal to leave the room during the delivery, it was Emma Hollister, arriving just in time after receiving their urgent message, who smoothed things over. "He stays," she said firmly. "That's his wife and child." After hours of labor that tested the limits of Kathleen's endurance, their son entered the world with a powerful cry that seemed to announce his determination to be heard. "Strong lungs," Dr. Wilson commented approvingly as he placed the squalling infant in Kathleen's arms. "A healthy boy." Chi stared at his son in wonder, gently touching the shock of black hair that crowned the tiny head. The baby's skin was a blend of his parents'. Not as dark as Chi's, not as fair as Kathleen's, but uniquely his own. "Thomas," Kathleen murmured, looking up at Chi. They had agreed to name a son after her father, honoring the man whose acceptance had made their union possible. "Thomas Benson," Chi agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Then, softer, meant only for her ears, "Little hawk in my language, for his spirit will be free." They brought Thomas home to the mountain when he was just 5 days old, returning to the sanctuary they had built together. The cabin welcomed them, now expanded and improved for their growing family. The cradle Chi had crafted stood ready beside their bed. Lined with soft blankets Emma had helped Kathleen sew during the final months of her pregnancy. As summer unfolded around them, they settled into a new routine, one dictated by Thomas's needs rather than the sun's position in the sky. Nights were broken by his hungry cries, days punctuated by moments of discovery as he began to take in the world around him. "He has your eyes," Kathleen observed one afternoon as she nursed him on the porch, the summer breeze gentle against her skin. Chi smiled, the expression coming more easily to him now. "And your stubbornness. Listen to how he demands what he wants." Their laughter mingled in the mountain air, a sound that had become more common in their home. There were still challenges, still moments of uncertainty about the future. The world beyond their mountain was changing rapidly, not always for the better. But here, in this place they had claimed for themselves, they had created something rare and precious. Captain Hollister brought news when autumn returned, his expression grave as he shared reports of new legislation being considered for the territory, laws that might make their marriage illegal, that might threaten their right to raise their son together. "It may never pass," he cautioned, seeing the fear in their eyes. "And even if it does, your union is already legal and recognized. They can't undo what's already done." "But they can make our lives difficult," Chi said quietly, watching through the window as Thomas crawled across a blanket spread on the porch, exploring his ever-expanding world. "Yes," Hollister admitted, "they can try." That night, after Thomas was sleeping soundly in his cradle, Kathleen found Chi standing outside, his face turned toward the star-filled sky. "What are you thinking?" she asked, slipping her arms around him from behind. He covered her hands with his own. "That we've built something beautiful here, something worth fighting for." Kathleen rested her cheek against his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Then we'll fight if we have to. Together." Chi turned in her arms, gathering her close. "Do you have regrets? About choosing this path? About choosing me?" The question surprised her. It had been months since he'd shown such uncertainty. "Not for a single moment," she said fiercely. "You are the best choice I ever made. You and Thomas are everything to me." His kiss was tender, filled with all the love that had grown between them in these years together. When they separated, Chi led her back toward the cabin, toward their son sleeping peacefully within. "Then whatever comes," he said, "whatever changes the world tries to impose, we face it as we have everything else, one day at a time, together." As they stepped back into the warmth of their home, Kathleen felt a sense of peace despite the uncertain future. They had defied expectations, crossed boundaries, created a family that existed in defiance of those who would keep them apart. And in doing so, they had found a happiness more profound than either had dared to imagine. Outside, the New Mexico wilderness stretched in all directions, wild and beautiful and free. Inside, a different kind of freedom flourished, the freedom to love without boundaries, to build a life of their own choosing, a freedom worth any price. 5 years later, the morning sun filtered through the pines, casting dappled shadows across the cabin clearing. Thomas, now 5 years old, chased a wooden hoop across the yard, his delighted laughter carrying on the summer breeze. His little sister, Sarah, named for Kathleen's mother, toddled after him on uncertain legs, determined to keep up with her older brother. Kathleen watched them from the porch, her hands busy shelling peas from the garden. The years had been kind to her face more weathered from sun and wind perhaps, but her eyes bright with the contentment of a life well lived. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. "Mama, look!" Thomas called, his dark eyes, so like his father's, gleaming with pride as he kept the hoop rolling with a stick. "I can make it go all the way to the barn." "I see you," Kathleen called back. "Mind your sister." Thomas dutifully slowed his pace, allowing Sarah to catch up. At just 2 years old, she was the image of Kathleen, with the same fair hair and determined chin, though her skin tone and the slight slant of her eyes spoke of her father's heritage. They were beautiful children, intelligent, kind, strong in body and spirit. Kathleen thanked God daily for their health and happiness, for the blessing of watching them grow in this place she and Chi had made for them. New Mexico had achieved statehood 3 years earlier, bringing with it the changes Captain Hollister had predicted. Some laws had indeed been passed that aimed to restrict marriages like theirs, but as he'd assured them, their existing union remained recognized. Their children were legitimate in the eyes of the law, their family protected by the documentation they'd so carefully secured. The town below their mountain had grown with the coming of the railroad. New faces appeared regularly, some bringing prejudice and old hatreds, others bringing fresh perspectives and a willingness to accept what was different. Slowly, over the years, Kathleen and Chi had found allies, friends who saw them as people rather than symbols or scandals. Mrs. Whitaker had been first among these, defending the Bensons fiercely when others spoke against them. The new schoolteacher, Miss Gardner, had welcomed Thomas warmly when he'd begun attending lessons in town the previous winter. Dr. Wilson had delivered both their children and treated the family with unfailing respect. Even Sheriff Marshall, while never friendly, had gradually shifted from hostility to a grudging acknowledgement of their right to exist. Jacob Mercer remained an enemy, still coveting their land, still occasionally making threats veiled as business propositions. But his influence had waned somewhat with the changing times. The water rights he'd so desperately wanted had become less critical with the construction of a new reservoir to serve the growing town. "Riders coming," Thomas announced, abandoning his hoop to shade his eyes against the sun. His eyesight was extraordinary, another gift from his father. Kathleen stood, scanning the trail below. 2 figures on horseback were indeed approaching, following the path that wound up from the valley. "It's Papa and Uncle James," Thomas exclaimed, recognizing them before Kathleen could. He raced down the path to meet them, Sarah toddling behind with cries of "Papa, Papa!" Chi had been gone for 3 days, accompanying Captain Hollister, now Major Hollister, on a mission to a nearby Apache settlement. A group of young men had left the reservation, causing concern among the army commanders. Hollister had requested Chi's help in negotiating their peaceful return, knowing his ability to bridge the cultural divide would be valuable. Kathleen watched as Chi dismounted, scooping both children into his arms with practiced ease. The years had changed him too, silver threads now appearing in his black hair, new lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. But his strength remained undiminished, as did the quiet dignity that had first drawn her to him. "Successful?" she asked as the men approached the cabin, Thomas now riding proudly on his father's shoulders. Chi nodded. "They're returning to the reservation. It was a misunderstanding, not a raid." Major Hollister dismounted more stiffly. The old war wound in his leg, bothering him as it often did in summer heat. "Your husband saved us all a great deal of trouble," he said, accepting Kathleen's offered canteen. "If the army had more men like him, we'd have fewer problems." "The army isn't ready for men like him," Kathleen replied with a smile, though they all knew the truth in her words. They shared a meal on the porch, catching up on news from town and the fort. Emma and their son would join them the following day for their monthly gathering, a tradition that had begun years ago and continued despite the increasing demands on the Major's time. After Hollister departed, promising to return with his family, the Bensons settled into their evening routine. Thomas helped Chi with the livestock, while Kathleen bathed Sarah and prepared her for bed. Later, with both children asleep, they sat together on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "I missed you," Kathleen said, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. The children did too. Chi's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I thought of you every moment." He was silent for a time, then added, "The young men at the settlement, they were angry, felt trapped between worlds, belonging nowhere." Kathleen understood his unspoken concern. "You worry about Thomas and Sarah?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "The world can be cruel to those who are different." "It can also be kind," she countered. "They have us. They have this place, and they'll have each other long after we're gone." Chi nodded slowly. "Yes, and they have something I never did at their age, knowledge of both sides of their heritage, pride in who they are." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely, wrapping the mountain in its velvet embrace. From inside came the soft sounds of their sleeping children, Thomas's occasional murmur, Sarah's gentle snores. "Would you change anything?" Chi asked suddenly. "If you could go back to that winter day when we first crossed the line between employer and—" "No," Kathleen said without hesitation. "Not a single moment. Every step, every challenge led us here." She turned to face him in the starlight. "Would you?" His answer came in the tender kiss he placed on her lips, in the way his hands still cradled her face, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, with their children sleeping safely nearby, they came together as they had countless times before, each touch a reaffirmation of the bond that had defied a world determined to separate them. And she never spoke of that night again, the night she had tried to deny what was growing between them. For now, when Chi said, "I can't stop thinking about you," Kathleen simply smiled and answered, "Then don't." For in the end, it wasn't about defiance or rebellion or even courage. It was simply about love, the kind that recognizes no boundaries, acknowledges no limitations, and transforms everyone fortunate enough to experience its power. A love worth any price. The end. Dear listener, after hearing Kathleen and Chi's story, of quiet love, of brave hearts defying the world's judgment, of building a life one choice at a time, I want to leave you with a warm embrace in the shape of words. Sometimes life feels heavy, cold, like the mountain winters of New Mexico, and loneliness may creep in without warning. But please hear this. You are not alone. Even now, by listening to this story, you are connecting with something deeper, with love, with compassion, with the enduring beauty of human kindness. Accepting others, fully, with all their differences, is a gift. And the fact that you're here, tuned in to this channel, shows just how special you are, someone with a thoughtful heart and an open mind. When that familiar wave of sadness comes, try this. Make a cup of tea or some warm, comforting cocoa. Close your eyes. And choose your thoughts. Yes, we have that power. We get to choose what we focus on. And if that's true, why choose the painful ones? Why spiral deeper when you can reach for better? Choose the good thoughts. Think of every hug you've received, every sunset you've witnessed, every time someone smiled at you. Think of springtime, of music, of stories like this one, where love finds a way. May tonight bring you peace. May your sleep be deep, safe, and healing. May you feel protected, held by something greater, and wake with gentle hope for what tomorrow may bring. You matter. You're here for a reason. With all our gratitude, the Wild West Whispers team. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartfelt story. We hope it brought you comfort, hope, and the gentle reminder that love often finds us in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it asks us to be brave enough to choose it. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with someone special, and subscribing to our channel. Your support means everything. It keeps us motivated to continue creating tales filled with love, redemption, and soul-healing twists. And remember, at the end of this video, you'll see a new story suggestion from our channel. Click on it and let yourself be surprised by another emotional journey. Thank you for being here.